Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, USA Today's NFL Wire site that covers the Arizona Cardinals, recording episode 531, a couple of weeks away from the draft. This is the first of our draft preview shows. I've got co-host Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site, and also one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast. And I will say we've got a bonus. I'll have a bonus show for you guys this week. Seth and I have two shows as we start our draft previews for the Cardinals. We're going to have 4 of those over the next 2 weeks. We're going to have our mock draft the week of the draft. But this week I'll also have a show with Howard Balzer, a new addition to CardsWire, legendary Cardinals reporter, covering the team forever. He's a Hall of Fame voter. And we're going to talk Pat Tillman, as he had Tillman's brother-in-law, Alex Garwood, on the SiriusXM's Hall of Fame radio. If you've been on CardsWire, you saw some of the Pat Tillman content that comes from Howard, and we'll bring him on the show this week to kind of talk and introduce him to the show, since we'll probably hear from him more over the next several months. But Seth is in our first draft preview, our Cardinals draft preview. We're going to limit it to 2 position groups. Like in years past, we would do like a big show on offense and a big show on defense as we've splitting things up. On this show, let's focus on the Cardinals' biggest offensive needs. And we're going to talk wide receiver, and we're going to talk the offensive line, but we'll do interior and tackle positions. This is a fun receiver group, isn't it, Seth?
Yeah, it is. And he's turning into, a big question on who, where, and why. And the reality is there's plenty of excellent choices, obviously. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Oh, my computer just shut down.
Oh.
I don't know what's happening. Hold on.
Okay.
Sorry, my screen's black, so I don't know if I'm gonna go out. Okay, they're back. I don't know what just happened. That's crazy. Okay.
That's so weird.
All right. Yeah, and so it's really interesting because you have so many talented players at the position for maybe the first time, or the most talented group in very, very long time. And that makes this draft really interesting because it creates a lot of questions / opportunities that you normally don't see. And that's what the Cardinals kind of have to decide, right?
Yeah, and if you look at the roster, you could say wide receiver is a clear, they need a number 1, but they need, honestly, more than just a number 1, right? They need developmental. They could use multiple receivers. We go back to 2019 when they drafted 3 receivers. Now, that I don't think we're going to go that route this year, where they drafted Andy Isabella, Hakeem Butler, and Keyshawn Johnson, and miss on all 3. But
let's hope not.
But I could see them drafting 2 receivers. And the thing is, and kind of how we're going to break this down in this show for those who are listening to this, as we've done in the years past, we'll talk day 1 guys, and the Cardinals have 2 picks, so we've got a lot of options in the first round. Who are day 2 guys that could fit with what the Cardinals needs, and some sleepers in day 3. Obviously, the guy is Marvin Harrison Jr., and I think it's been well detailed that people keep talking, Todd McShay, Adam Schefter. They keep throwing things out there that some teams might have Rome Odunze or Malik Neighbors ranked higher than Harrison. But if you look at the draft at the betting community, the sports books, they ain't buying it. Since Harrison is still like minus 600 to be the first receiver drafted. And unless that starts to shift, I see no reason to believe anything else. And how about you tell us, Seth, tell everyone, what are the main differences between, because those three guys, in my opinion, are all three guys an alpha receiver? Like any team, they'd be the alpha on pretty much any team. And if that's the case, what do they differ at?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing with all of them is they obviously have different skills. I would say that when you look at a guy like Harrison Jr., he ends up being what most call, the most complete receiver. He is the complete package in terms of ability, in terms of creating separation, in terms of catching the football, in terms of route running, in terms of after the catch. Like he wins at all the levels. One of the interesting notes that good buddy of mine, Matt Harmon, who runs Reception Perception, talked about with it when it comes to Harrison Jr. is that he is doubled more than any other receiver
and still separates.
And well, not just that, and his success rate is double the next closest guy.
That's crazy. And especially the variance in his quarterback play over the last two seasons, because one year he had C.J. Stroud, and then last year he had, I don't remember the name of the guy, but I knew it at one point.
Kyle McCord, yeah.
Kyle McCord, and you probably won't. No one else will probably remember Kyle McCord outside of the Buckeye Nation in a couple of years.
Right. And so what's crazy is Marvin Harrison, his double coverage rate is on route. He ran routes 40 times against double coverage. And he had a success rate of 28 wins, what they call wins, so 70%. But that was 17% of his routes that he was double covered. Malik Neighbors had 25 instances where he was double covered, so 15 less. He had 13 success, so 52%, so still really good. Like, that's not bad, but that's only 9% of his routes. So only 9% of his routes were double covered. And then Roma Dunze was even less, 22. He had a really good rate, 17% he won on, but that was only 7% of his routes. So you're talking about a guy that, despite consistently being, the focus of the defense, still put up numbers to win the Biletnikoff Award with, like you said, a quarterback that's now a Syracuse level quarterback because he is at Syracuse. So it's just one of those things. Neighbors is an interesting guy because Neighbors is a guy that does a lot of his work at and around the line of scrimmage and after the catch. And those are things that aren't bad things ever. I don't want anybody to think that I'm saying they're bad things, but they're things that, unless you have Tyreek Hill level speed consistently, you're talking about wins that don't happen as often in the NFL. And so he is phenomenal as an accelerator. He has really, really strong route running. It's slightly below Marvin Harrison Jr.'s, but it's again, it's one of those, we're talking about if one guy's a 10, the next guy's a 9. Like, it's not like we're talking about,
yeah, right.
a 10 versus 6. And the thing with Neighbors that stands out is that extra gear, that athleticism, and that change of direction ability that he shows with the ball in his hands. And it makes him a different type of receiver.
So
That
he's a scary, like for defenses, he's scarier with the ball
right,
than perhaps Harrison once he has the ball in his hands, while Harrison is he's the nightmare to guard, period.
right, and a great comp for like neighbors that I've seen that I really like is like, and this is obviously high end, but you're talking about like Antonio Brown level, like
that, and you have to remember Antonio Brown was not a first round pick, but the type of impact player that you can have
right.
is that. Well, as opposed to Harrison, but you talk about him at the same level as draft prospects like Julio Jones, AJ Green, and even Calvin Johnson, right? That's the level of talent that Harrison brings.
Right. And when you look at Harrison, for me, like his high end comps typically come out like Fitz and Devontae Adams. So like they're more of the it's not the pure athleticism. And people always get this like messed up of like, oh, they're not great athletes. It's like, no, they're phenomenal athletes. It's just not, they're just not the explosive athletes. They're very smooth. It sometimes looks really easy when they're doing it, right? Like they're a different style.
Well,
and a different
right. And like you say, Larry Fitzgerald was slow. Anquan Bolden had a bad 40 time. Larry Fitzgerald was sub 4.5. Come on.
yeah.
And we saw him run, like we saw him in his career run away from players well into his career. So
right. And the big thing with like that separator for like a Neighbors versus a Harrison Jr. Is that Harrison Jr. is just a little cleaner with his routes. He's he has better hands, and he wins more consistently against different coverages. Again, it's not taking anything away from Neighbors. Like when I make my big board, those guys are both going to be like top. I mean, Harrison Jr. is going to be number one, but like Neighbors is probably going to be 3 or 4. Like it's not like we're talking about like going from 1 to 27.
Right,
so it's
right.
it's Odunze is a different type of guy, right? Like Odunze is a smaller like Mike Evans like type of guy.
Blake gave me, I saw it on Twitter, I think it was, and I think it's the first time I saw it, but I thought the comp was really good. DeAndre Hopkins, right? He plays like DeAndre Hopkins, doesn't he?
Right, and that's the type of he wins at all levels. He's a very good athlete, great catch radius, good. He manipulates routes really well. That's one of the things that you watch with him is his ability to change the speed at which he's running routes, and then he's a good blocker. He's a physical guy. It's really interesting because what's hard to judge about Rome as opposed to the other two is that he doesn't get a lot of chances to make plays with the ball in his hands, in terms of like short passes. And so people, are like, oh, he doesn't, he's not a yak guy. He wasn't. I don't disagree with that. It doesn't mean that,
fairness, his depth of target was
right. And that's where I struggle with that, criticism. It's not really a criticism, but that criticism of him is that he was targeted a lot down the field. I mean, you're talking about a guy that of his, what he ended up with almost 1,650 yards, almost half of it was deep yard, which is absurd, right?
Right. Well, and that was a combination of a couple things. One, it's his ability to make those plays, which makes him dynamic. Washington's offense and Michael Penix Jr., who throws a really good deep ball.
Right, exactly. And so when you look at those things, it really becomes a pick your flavor type where, you've seen the most out of and most consistency out of Marvin Harrison Jr. So there's less questions, and it feels like the high end and low end are the range of outcomes are closer together. I mean, your low end outcome might, and it's crazy to say something like this, your low end outcome might be an AJ Green, right? That
who was up until the last year in last couple of years in Cincinnati, who was consistently known as one of the very best receivers in the NFL.
Right. And so that, if that's your on the, lower end, and that's probably unfair to AJ Green because like you said, how good he was in Cincy, especially those first, 5 years.
Like the first 8 years there were basically.
Yeah. Pro Bowl years, which is absurd. And then like you said, you're talking about a guy like that, that could end up on the level of like a Devontae Adams, Larry Fitzgerald level, where you're talking about a 3, 4, 5-time all-pro level receiver, a guy that leads the NFL in yards and touchdown receptions, which is, again, it's an insane thing to say, but that's the level of talent that you're talking about with a guy like him. I mean, and so that's where you have to figure out those things. And like I said, Neighbors, again, another extremely high-end, high-level talent. So that here's the thing. You have those three, right? And we'll just use like the consensus big board as we always do. It's just the easiest way to do it. And you look at the consensus big board and Marvin's 3, Malik is 5, Rome is 7. So again, we're splitting hairs. That's how good these guys all are. It's not I wouldn't say a drop off after that, Jess, but like the next guy is in the late teens, early 20s.
Yes, and in terms of Cardinals perspective, so if where they stay where they're at, it feels like they've got the 4th pick. Harrison's the guy. If they trade back, they're probably not going to get any of them unless they trade back up and to get to target one of those 3s. It's that crazy. So if they drop, unless they drop to 6, if they drop to one of those teams like the Minnesota pick, for example, they will not have the opportunity to get any of those 3 receivers by number 11 because all 3 I'm certain will be off the board in the first 10 unless they move back up. And then we get into the other part of things, and there's another talented receivers, but I've said this a few times. The Cardinals have such a need at receiver right now, but one thing they need first and foremost, they need, and you could say that Trey McBride can be that guy. They need their alpha receiver. Arizona's used to having an alpha receiver. It had 2 alphas in Anquan Bolden and Larry Fitzgerald. They added DeAndre Hopkins. And even, Hollywood had the mentality as well. He was quieter about it, but you just had it. You had your clear-cut number 1. And those 3 guys, you probably could be that as a rookie. I am far less, like the rest of the guys in the draft, as talented as they are, I'm not super sold on most of them as being able to be the guy. And because the Cardinals don't already have an established, hey, I'm the leader of this group, it makes those other guys a little less good of a fit, in my opinion. You and I talked about last show, and let's talk about it right now. Is the one other guy of the first roundish receivers A.D. Mitchell, and why is that? Because some people disagree.
Yeah, I mean, there's never going to be a consensus on anything. I mean, we're even still, fighting Marvin Harrison versus, Rome Odunze versus So there's never going to be a consensus as much as it feels like there could be or should be. A.D. Mitchell's a really interesting one because the people I talk to, the people I trust, look at him and they see an alpha. They see a guy that, had good success at two stops, didn't play in heavy pass first type of offenses, right? Like you look at A.D. Mitchell at Georgia, he had decent numbers, nothing great. And then he goes to Texas, and again, he puts up good numbers, nothing great. But he's a guy that when you watch him, especially against single coverage, that guy wins a lot, and he wins in a lot of different ways. And so, you're talking about a guy that for his size, and not just for his size, but for, a guy that's over 6'2", that came in at 205 pounds. He runs that 4.34, which is elite. And then he's explosive, a really good vertical and broad jump. So shows really incredible explosiveness. And you look at him and you see guys that have similar styles. He's not quite as big as like a T. Higgins, right? But he plays in the same manner as T. And you and I talked about last week, our biggest concern with T. Higgins is not the production. There's no concern about the production. It's the fact that he's been nicked up since he was at Clemson. And so, the idea of going to a guy like Higgins and paying him, 20 plus million a year, and it just doesn't feel like it's especially when you can get a T. Higgins at theoretically 27, right? And so that's the thing with Mitchell. The next guy that's kind of jumped him in terms of the race to be the next receiver, he's really interesting because he's the true kind of 1-year wonder. That offense obviously at LSU was just unbelievably prolific, right? I mean, it was a absurd chest of riches they had. And this guy kind of came onto the scene this year, Brian Thomas Jr., getting mocked in the first round. I've seen him mocked as high as like in the
teens, in the early teens. I've seen it, and just depends. And that's the weird thing about this is that you the measurables, they're unbelievable. You've got the length, you've got elite speed, you have the production, but you've said it. And the one thing about Thomas is, guess what? He wasn't the alpha on that team, right? That was Neighbors.
Right. And you look at his production and Matt Harmon, again, I'll always trumpet Matt this time of year, especially for wide receivers. If you want to get a great look at receivers and their routes, I highly, highly recommend Matt Harmon. Reception Perception. It's not overly expensive, especially if you just do it from January till May. Matt will have no idea I even said this, but I highly recommend it. It's an incredible value. Anyways, so Thomas is interesting because he's literally number 2 to Rome in terms of deep catch production, and his is even more staggering. So this guy had 1,100 and almost, let's just call it 1,200 for math, 1,200 yards. Jess, almost 800 yards were go routes and hitches. And hitches, for those that don't know, are selling the go route, and then it's just
stop and turn.
It's stop and turn. And so, I mean, almost 800 yards of his 1,200 yards were go routes, Jess, and 10 of his touchdowns were on go routes. And it's just, you have, it's a trump card, right? It's when
Right.
we talked about Will Fuller coming out. I don't know how many of you guys remember Will Fuller, the dynamic Notre Dame player. That's kind of what it reminds me of. Obviously, he's a little bit bigger than Will. Will was 6 foot 186, so good size still. It's not like he was a small player by any means. But Thomas came in at almost 6'3", call it 6'3" for easy, and 209, and ran a 4.33. So he is.
That's incredible.
Yeah, he is. But he's got that long range. His initial burst isn't bad by any means. I don't want anybody to think I'm saying it's bad, but he's not as like AD Mitchell's like in the 90th percentiles for his jumps. Brian's in the 80th. So again, we're talking splitting hairs here, but it's little things like that you do see. You're like, and he's just not a overly seasoned route guy. Like he's just not.
He feels like he'd be a perfect skill guy for someone who already has Tampa Bay. Could you imagine him in Tampa Bay or Miami?
Right,
with,
exactly.
With the receivers they already have, he would put up monster yards. But guess what? It works. He works better as he has elite talent, but would be more complementary to someone who is a number one already, who's going to draw all the attention, or who's going to be getting all the attention all the time.
Right. And a great example of that would be if say, Cincinnati is able to get like a 2 for T. Higgins, Brian Thomas would be a great addition there to play off of Jamar Chase, right? Like just a phenomenal number 2, because now you can't, if you man him up with a corner, he's going to beat 75% of them. And if you put a safety over the top, now you're basically one-on-one with Jamar Chase. So it's like that, exactly what you're saying, pick your poison. So again, he is, and I think you hit the nail on the head, Jess. He is an exemplary example of like, and I shouldn't say never, but it would never happen. But like if the Cardinals took Marvin Harrison at 4 and then took him at 28 or 27, right? Like,
that's crazy. But oh my gosh, that would be great.
But that's kind of what you're looking at though. Like it's that pairing, that's what he needs. And then he'll be the guy.
Like the example that I used before and probably like DJ Chark, he had 1,000-yard season, right? And he's built kind of the same way. He's long, he's got elite speed, but Chark has just never been the guy. He had a good season, and Thomas, and we've seen. I mean, how many long, speedy receivers have we seen? Not like Kevin White, guys just not do well.
Right, and that's the thing is you have 1 year of high level production in a very friendly offense. Where was the production in 2022? Where was the production in 2021? It wasn't there. And he had just an incredible breakout season. Don't get me wrong, but it's like for a team like the Cardinals, that's just not, it just doesn't feel like the type of player that you're looking
Baltimore, Tampa, Miami, those are all great places for him, and he would thrive. I don't think he would thrive here. He would be, Cardinals fans would be disappointed probably because
and a great example of it would be like Buffalo. I don't think he'd be a good fit in Buffalo because they don't have
Diggs.
Right, they don't have that alpha opposite him. So now all of a sudden you're asking him to be the guy, maybe not year one, but coming out, and that makes it tough. So so those are the first round guys. Then you get into the early day 2 guys, right? And you're talking.
Do you think Xavier Worthy's going to get in the first round?
I would expect so, just because that's an unheard of time. But
isn't he still the same type? Like you guys, I heard on the one thing you like, he wasn't chopped liver. Like he wasn't just a one-trick pony because he had nearly 1,000 yards as a true freshman, and then passed 1,000 yards this last season. he actually, right, didn't he? He actually had more receiving yards than A.D. Mitchell, did he not, this
Yes.
past year? And
Yes.
so, but you've got, he's the speedy guy, and Mitchell is your number one. Worthy, I think, would be a nice fit if, and that's the thing. That's the thing is that for the Cardinals, like for me, I want the Cardinals to get an alpha because they need it, unless they're going to acquire him some way else. And so trading out and to get, well, Brian Thomas would be a talented receiver. Mitchell, you know, if you trade back, and maybe you can maximize, and this is the kind of, you know, draft, you know, you're not gonna be disappointed if it's Marvin Harrison, but maybe if you're trying to maximize your 2 first-round picks, because the receiver class is more talented and deeper than the pass rush class. If the Cardinals traded back, were able to get Dallas Turner at the pass rush and A.D. Mitchell later in the first round, that's probably, if you can't have Harrison, that's probably your best case scenario for, you know, your outcomes for the first round. That said, but yeah, Worthy. So how do you think there's going to be? Do you think it'll be, in the end, it will be 6 receivers that go in round 1?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like 5 is a lock, and 6 is the wild card with Worthy and Lad McConkey, because McConkey is an interesting one because he's older, right? He's an older prospect, and so those guys have been kind of hit and miss. Real quick, back to Worthy, you know, you mentioned it, and you mentioned obviously the world-class speed, the fastest guy ever timed. What's really interesting about him is that you see that speed allows him, much like Marquise Hollywood Brown, allows him to be open on a lot of different things. So, you know, his go route numbers weren't incredible. In fact, it's kind of hard to hit guys like him on a go route. We've seen that with Marquise, but you know, he ate guys up on hitches, which we talked about earlier, and he really did a nice job on outs and speed outs, because you have to be in such a back pedal that when he breaks, it's over, right? Like because you can't get beat over the top. So you have to give so much cushion. And so that's the thing with him. He's not a guy that's going to live across the middle. We know that. Like, it's not his strength. He's 165 pounds soaking wet. He's a very lean guy. But if you can get a guy, you know, if you can get him on those out routes, if you can hit a couple deeps with him, it really just opens up the game for him, and will change, you know, how teams have to defend him. McConkey's the interesting one because, you know, he is the yeoman. He's the guy that kind of just goes to work, wins at a lot of different levels, has elite speed, you know, at the sub 4.4, but he does a pretty consistent job everywhere. Now, I always say these guys are tough coming out of Georgia because their offense sucks. I mean, their quarterbacks, Stetson Bennett's a nice story. Carson Beck is okay, but it's not like they're, you know, it's not like they're putting up all world numbers. I mean, we're talking about a guy whose career high was 762 yards. It's not, and 7 touchdowns. Like, he's not a guy that wins or is going to put up those eye-popping numbers, but he does everything well, and that's what makes him, you know, really good. And I think it goes back to what you kind of said, Jess, is if you're a team like Kansas City that, you know, you can use it, Xavier Worthy, or you can get a Lad McConkey that does everything, and you don't have to, you know, you can use them in a number of different ways. You know, it's always dangerous after a guy put up such an elite year, but a lot leaner, not as heavy, but like Puka Nakua, right? Like he actually tested better than Puka did, but like a very nuanced, very physical guy that just looks like he's going to be successful. The problem is Nakua set that bar, so incredibly high this year that
I'm going to say this about Puka. I was really excited about that, but he actually came in at the perfect time because
right.
if Cooper Kupp is healthy at the start of the year, Puka's not having that season.
No, you're probably talking about an 800-900 yard type of season,
which is still great.
Phenomenal. And so that's the thing. So, if you get McConkey and he comes in to a situation like Kansas City, he's probably going to put up 750 yards. That's not a bad season.
Nope.
But the question becomes, if he comes into Arizona, is he going to put up 750 yards? And that's and that
would be a disappointment. That would be a disappointment for Cardinals fans because what are we used to from our receivers? We're used to Larry Fitzgerald. We're used to DeAndre Hopkins. We forget the Michael Floyd fans were disappointed in him. There was the point we believed, and if you've been listening to this show long enough, there was a point when I said on the show, I believe we're seeing Michael Floyd become the best receiver on this team, and then after that he flamed out. So sorry about that, guys.
And so you just look at it. I mean, so those are the kind of the 7 that get thrown around the first round, and then you've got the interesting day 2 group, right? So again, if for some reason they trade back from 4 and miss out on the top 3, and then things just go haywire, and whether it's at 23 or 27, A.D. Mitchell and Brian Thomas are gone, and we kind of explained why maybe McConkey and Worthy aren't the best choices at that point. You've got an interesting next group. Troy Franklin, out of Oregon, extremely talented receiver, high production numbers the last couple of years. 891 last year, 9 touchdowns, and then 1,383 and 14 touchdowns this year. A guy that wins in a very similar way to Brian Thomas. So I don't know, for those of you that have been listening for a long time, we talk about the 80% rule, and it's like if you can draft a guy that's the same or 80% of the guy, but 30 picks later or 20 picks later in this case, why wouldn't you? The thing is with Franklin, and I don't know if it matters as much anymore because we've seen guys like Devontae Smith, Chris Olave, these guys that aren't overly, obviously Marquise Hollywood Brown, that aren't overly thick go early, but we've never seen a guy that's 6'2" and 175 pounds, and that's what Franklin came in at. Now, that being said, it is metrics and numbers are insane, and he again is incredibly smooth. But in that Oregon offense, he did run a lot of routes into the middle of the field, especially slants and posts. But those are tough when you're talking about guys. Again, the NFL is a lot different, and the spacing and how fast they come downhill is a lot different. I've seen comps for Troy Franklin like Christian Watson. I don't hate that. And Watson, did he go in the first or the second? He went fairly high. I think people were a little surprised at how high he ended up going to the Packers a couple years ago. He went 34th overall. Yeah. So, and he's never really he's dealt with some injuries. He's never really lived up to the pick. So that could be a concern. Again, you just always get concerned when a guy is that lean. It's just not something that we see a ton of. A comp I've seen that I don't hate is Jameson Williams. We never got Jameson Williams.
He still hasn't done it yet.
Right. And so that's the thing with Franklin that raises the question. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Keon Coleman, right? You have a guy that is large, and that's putting it mildly. You rarely see
Florida State receivers, because they've got another, what is like Johnny Wilson. He's Florida State, isn't he?
Yeah, former ASU great.
Holy cow.
Yeah,
Big
and
guys.
Coleman is, he didn't test as well as people expected him to, because this is a guy that was a legitimate D1
Michigan State
basketball.
basketball. He could have gone to Michigan State, and that's a great basketball school. He's
Right.
incredibly athletic. I felt I liked him more. It was earlier, and Blake pointed out the lack of routes. Did he not get asked to do a lot of things in the? Was he asked to do less in the passing game at Florida State?
Yeah, and that also is what comes up with guys like this that come over. He's not like you said, a guy that's going to run a ton of different routes. I shouldn't say that. He ran them, but it's not like he had a ton of success with them. Let's put it that way. Some of that was the Florida State offense, especially post Jordan Travis, where he just wasn't able. They weren't able to get things going. But he has a couple trump cards that we talked about earlier. Obviously, his size being one of them, 6'3", 215. His leaping ability and his catch radius are elite. He has incredible hands. He's very stiff as in terms of running those in-breaking and out-breaking routes. It's just not his thing or what he's best at.
DK Metcalf without the elite speed.
Right. Exactly. Type of thing. And so he doesn't have the trump card of Metcalf in terms of speed, but he has this size and the ability to win in those routes and things like that. I like Coleman. I just don't know where he fits in terms of the overall rankings of this class, because like you kind of said, you need to have a neighbors that to pair with him, right?
Yeah.
Like he can't. And so is a Michael Wilson, Keon Coleman, Greg Dortch stack enough? Probably not. It's probably not where you want to be in that group. So again, if you are talking about, a trade back and you end up taking, one of the top three guys, and then you go in and you see Coleman on the board at 66, somehow he makes it down that far. Not a bad fit, actually. Wouldn't be bad at all.
What about guys like Xavier Legette, Brendan Rice, and Johnny Wilson? Johnny Wilson's going to be. You think he's going to be more day 3, or will he be a late day 2?
I don't know if somebody will take a chance on him on day 2. I would wager he ends up on day 3. You just rarely see guys that size at 6'7".
He's absurd. Though he said at the combine, it's like literally no one's talked to him about playing tight end.
Right. And so he's he's a different type of guy. And so you would see him probably in the same realm as where you saw Hakeem Butler go, right? Like top
of the 4th round.
Yeah, top of 4th round type of thing. When it comes to these guys, so you've got guys like Ricky Pearsall and Roman Wilson who are the superb route runner types, right?
And Pearsall's a guy who can do literally everything.
Right, and he freak athlete. Tested really well, has just never put it together on the field. Progressed slowly every year. Obviously people remember him at ASU and then his Florida years. He hasn't dealt with great quarterback play. So that's where he feels like, a guy that is bound, and not in a negative way, to be a dynamic slot receiver, a guy that at 6'1", 189 isn't the size of a slot guy that you normally see, but kind of like a
gadgety player that'll have a lot of success in the league.
Yeah, a guy, who he really reminds me of, like Danny Amendola, who, was a good receiver for a long time in the NFL, caused headaches here all the time when he was with
With the Rams.
the Rams.
Oh.
Yeah. So, that type of guy, gonna be a consistent 600-700 yard a year guy, but probably is not going to be. I mean, in today's NFL, maybe he gets, because remember, by the time the league really opened up, Danny was 32, so it wasn't like he was a spring chicken anymore. So he's a guy that I like. Roman Wilson is a guy. Again, it's always crazy to me when guys like Roman Wilson are now starting to get some hype and projection, and their quarterback's being projected as like a top 5 pick, and they didn't put up any numbers, right? Like, that's always so weird to me. But Wilson's is in the same mold as that. Like, he's a incredibly gifted player at every level. He came in a little bigger than people expected him to be, but he loves to live across the middle. He reminds me, I mean, he tested a little more athletically, but reminds me a lot of like a Hines Ward, like a great route runner, a guy that does all the dirty work, that type of guy. Again, I'm not sure if that's a guy you want as your number one, right? But Legette's the interesting one because he's gonna get Debo Samuel comps, and you look at him, he's had one great year. He's used in a variety of ways at South Carolina. He is massive at 6'1", 220. He is incredibly athletic, incredible burst. But he's never been the guy. And he lives and dies on those in breaking crossing routes because of his size and his suddenness. And again, at the NFL, you say, okay, can that play consistently? But dude's built like a running back. I mean, he's the closest thing I've seen to like an Anquan Bolden level of violence type of player. And he put up absurd numbers this year, 1,255 yards and 7 touchdowns. But I mean, he just murders people on crossing routes and in breaking routes, and that's his game. He's almost like a big slot guy, right? He's not a guy that's going to be a vertical type threat, down the field consistently type threat, which isn't a bad thing if you're talking about a guy at 61 to pair with a guy you drafted early. From there, you mentioned Brendan Rice. Rice is an interesting one because like Roman Wilson, you're talking about a guy that never broke out despite playing with Caleb Williams for 2 years, right? That he just never put up the numbers that anybody really expected, but he was consistent the last 2 years, 611 yards, 791 yards, 12 touchdowns this year compared to 4 last year. And he's a guy that came out 6'2", 208 pounds, but only ran a 4.5, didn't wow anybody with his jumps or athleticism, but he has incredible route running skills, and he feels redundant, but not in a bad way, to like a Michael Wilson.
Right. Like, isn't he like a slightly less quick Michael Wilson? That's the thing. Michael Wilson, if we remember his combine, his 40 time was pretty average, but his 10-yard split was top 10%, which was crazy.
You've got, and then from there, you've got some interesting, day 2 guys. Jalen Polk, the other Washington receiver. Jalen McMillan, the other Washington receiver. Dynamic weapons that really do get overlooked because of how dominant Odunze was. Both guys that I think would be solid number 2s in the NFL. Malachi Corley is a guy I love, coming out of Western Kentucky. He's similar to Legette in a lot of ways, just has done it for multiple seasons as opposed to just the one. But again, you're talking about a guy on day 2 that has to come out and prove it now that he's going to be at the next level. I mean, last year he had 1,300 yards this year, 1,000 yards for Western Kentucky as like the main guy. And his game against Ohio State is the one that if you have questions, you should go watch because he played extremely well. He's a guy, he's a difference maker with the ball in his hands. So we'll see, where he ends up in the scheme of things, but 5'11", 210, another running back build type of guy. And then there's the next group. There's Jermaine Burton, Tez Walker out of North Carolina, Javon Baker out of UCF, Malik Washington, Jamari Thrash. These guys are all going to go in that 90 to 100, 130 range. Talented receivers that each, they lack that trump card that we talked about with some of these other guys. They didn't run fast. They're not overly, Justin and I always say this, and we never mean it in a negative way, but it's a very negative term and connotation. But they're Jags, right? They're just average guys. And what that means is they haven't shown what their trump card is yet. We talked about Troy Franklin.
They don't have any elite traits, and sometimes that's good. So let's take, for example, last season, Emari DeMercado. There is nothing about him that you would thought was special coming out of the draft, but he did everything pretty good. He did everything really. He was successful at pretty much anything he did not at a high end level, but a productive NFL level.
Right. And that's where all these guys kind of fit in, and not in a negative way. I mean, you're talking about guys that look like and project to have long, solid NFL careers, but they all look like guys that'll probably end up being, wide receiver 3 types.
They're guys that you're always looking to replace.
Right. That you are exactly. And that's kind of where they fall in at. Tez Walker is the one that most people probably think know about, because the expectation level for him when he came in was that, oh man, he's going to help put Drake May over the top. And they just never really got it going together, and so that makes it really difficult to see where and how he fits, right? But yeah, I mean, this is an elite class of receivers because you have a little bit of everything. I've seen it.
Are there any day three names just to throw out there? Because day three, anyone to be worth to know about for day three.
Yeah, and you look at it, there's a couple, and I think the one to know and the big one overall, because he's a local guy, is Jacob Cowing. And he came in and basically measured almost exactly like Tank Dell. This is the thing. Don't fall in love with outliers. And that's not a shot at Cowing, right? It's really hard to be 5'8", 165, 70 pounds, whatever he was, and have success. And remember, Dell did that in 11 games. So, you might look at that and go, that's phenomenal. Yeah, but he could only stay healthy for 11 games. So that's, when you're talking about guys that size, that's the rub. You get him on day 3 and he works out. That's fantastic. But, Houston took Dell in the 3rd round. I just don't advocate for things like that. I love what Cowing brings and what he's shown and flashed, but not a guy I would take until, that 100+ range. Cornelius Johnson, the other Michigan wide receiver, again, another guy to note, kind of a ho-hum type career from a guy that's going to get drafted probably on day 3 in the 4th or 5th round. He looks like a guy that can contribute and make a roster and stay on it. The problem's going to be, like we talked about, you had Puka Nacua, and so now everybody's going to go, hey, go find Puka Nacua. It's like, no, that doesn't happen every year. And so we'll see how it works out. But Johnson's another one, again, kind of a redundant, similar to Michael Wilson type, but probably not even as talented as what Wilson was coming out.
Coming up next on the Rise of Zero podcast, Mr. of Cardinals Talk of the Web. We turned the show into almost an hour of receiver top. Let's move on to the next segment of the offense we're looking at. We're going to talk about the interior offensive line. We won't talk as much about that. It's not there's some good guys, not quite as good. That's coming up next on Rise of Zero. We're back on the Rise of Spirit podcast, the best Cardinals talk on the web. Interior offensive line, we don't have to worry about at the top of the draft, but we know that there's a handful of guys, right? If you're talking center, Jackson Power Johnson out of Oregon seems to be like plug him in, Tyler Lindenbaum, Creed Humphreys level talent. You've got Graham Barton, the Duke, who played tackle but projects more as a guard, right? And is there anyone else of that ilk who is guard-like at the next level, guard/center? Zach Frazier comes to mind at kind of the end of the first round, top of the second, kind of that day one, day two range, early day two.
Yeah, I love Frazier. He's actually my favorite of the draft. You guys know how I kind of every year fall in love with one interior offensive lineman, and they tend to actually hit most of the time. Frazier's that guy this year. I mean, it's an easy call when you're talking about, like you said, an early day two type of guy. I'm not taking any risk or anything like that, but I mean, you're talking about a guy 6'3", 313 that a multi-time state championship wrestler, played a ton of snaps at West Virginia, had incredible success at West Virginia. He is exactly kind of what you're looking for. The concern with him is being that he's never played the guard position. So, whereas Jackson Powers Johnson has played some right guard for Oregon, Frazier played all his snaps at center. So that's obviously one. But yeah, I love him. Christian Haynes out of UConn's another one. He's a really, fun guy to watch. He's another kind of big guy. Good size, good power. He is he is an athlete. I think that's kind of the best way to explain him, but he is a guy that he jumped 33 inches on the vertical, which is explosive for a guy that's 317 pounds. And then he had a really nice 40 time at 5 flat. So he's a guy that just projects. Looks like he's going to be able to play at the next level on the interior. He's only played right guard, which is always, an interesting thing to me. Can they make the switch over to left guard? Because you would have to assume that they're going to leave Will Hernandez, who was kind of their best offensive lineman last year.
Will is definitely a right guard. But, I mean, if they like what they have, the guy they draft at the end of round one doesn't necessarily need to start, or they draft and because they don't have an interior guy under contract after this year.
Yeah, and the guy that I love and that I've been filling out when I do the mock draft simulations in round 3 in that 90 range is Mason McCormick out of South Dakota State. 6'4", 310, a little bit undersized right now, probably needs another 10 to 15 pounds, but he is one of the nastiest guys in this draft. He is a mauler. He loves to bring the fight to you. He's a true left guard, played it all 3 years, all his snaps there at South Dakota State. Yeah, he is.
He hits the short shuttle metric that we pointed out last year about John Gaines, and it's I can't remember who it is, who is one of the draft guys out there. That is
Josh Norris.
Yeah, Josh Norris. It's a cheat code. It really is. It's a cheat code for offensive linemen, a draftable offensive lineman that beats 4.47 on the short shuttle, basically is a lock to be a starter in his career. Here are the guys that fit that. Wisconsin's Tanner Bortolini, 4.28. Crazy. You've got Dylan McMahon, center, North NC State, 4.33. You've got Mason McCormick at 4.45. He hits that. And I think that is it that are under that 4.47. Cooper Beebe, which is really close. I know he's a guy that a lot of guys really like out of Kansas State. He doesn't hit that metric, but is 6'3", 322 pounds, ran the 40 in 5.03 seconds. How?
Dominic Pooney is another one that hit that metric.
Oh, yeah, 4.40 Kansas guard, 6'5", 313.
Yeah.
Are
so
all of those guys draftable? That's the thing, because he's
right.
Josh Norris, he talks about is draftable. How many of those will end up being undrafted?
No, Pooney's definitely going to get drafted. Probably a day 3 guy, probably in that 90 range. So he's a guy that will go there. The other guy that's really interesting, and you mentioned, Jess, that they don't have anybody under contract. And that,
John Gaines. They've got John Gaines. But
right. But basically
Dennis
nobody.
Dennis Daly's done. Elijah Wilkinson's done. Tristan Cologne's done. Evan Brown's done. Yilda Froholt's done. Will Hernandez. Kelvin. Basically, their entire offensive line, outside of Paris Johnson and Jonah Williams and John Gaines, we don't know what's happening after 2024.
But day 3, probably in the 5th or 6th round, Zach Zenter, the guy that broke his leg. I can't remember. I think it was in the Ohio State game. He is an absolute tank. And 6'6", 310. He is, we know he's coached well. Michigan guys tend to be successful. So like you said, you're coming out not having, anybody in, you're not really rushing him, right? But he's coached well. We won't have athletic testing just because obviously, broken leg, not going to be able to test. But he is truly one of the most elite interior run blockers in this draft. And could be a guy that really fits what Petzing and company are looking for on day 3 without the concern or pressure of like, oh, will he play this year? Maybe, probably not, recovering from a broken leg, a guy that you can stock away for a year and then, see if he can fill that right guard hole. Kind of, he's obviously not as big as Will Hernandez is listed at 330, looks every bit of 350, but similar style, talking about being just a devastating interior physical mauler type.
Anybody of note other than that? The interesting thing is at the top of the draft, that second first round pick around 27, you get a guy Zach Frazier, you get a guy Graham Barton, you get a guy Jackson Powers Johnson. Those are all especially if you go Frazier and JPJ. Do you put them? Are they good enough that they're going to replace Froholt immediately, or would we see them compete at left guard? They've got a lot of guys at left guard. They've got like so many guys at left guard, and they've got Yilda, who I'm assuming that they were very pleased with last year, but he doesn't have anything guaranteed in his contract this year. So if they find something better, okay. Evan Brown's contract suggests he's going to be on the roster this year, so we'll have to wait and see. But would it be worth pulling the trigger on a guy like JPJ at 27, or even and when you guys hear this, I'm in the middle of a network mock draft for the NFL Wire, and I'm looking to jump up a couple of spots to get JPJ. It's just how the draft has fallen. And he's good enough. Like the Cardinals had tried to get a guy, like they wanted Tyler Linderbaum back when they traded for Hollywood, that you could plug him in at center immediately. Maybe you shift him over at guard. Maybe you put him in at center, let Yilda be part of the mix at left guard. I don't know, but he's worth getting in that round 1, even if you don't necessarily have a place for him immediately.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is a guy like him probably earns a spot immediately. So, you don't come in with the idea that he's going to be a starter, but he's going to be hard to keep out of that starting role, and probably beats out, like you said, either Brown or Froholt, whoever they determine is the weakest link of that group.
Anybody else worth looking at?
There's plenty of guys, but this is a really, you mentioned Cooper Beebe. Cedric Van Pran is an interesting one. Christian Mahogany out of Boston College, I really like. Bo Limmer's the really interesting one because he might be the most athletic player of the group overall. I'm double checking his numbers. Yeah,
6'4", He's lean. He's lean for
and that's what the problem is with him is he's a guy that's going to have to put on weight. Played 2 years at right guard, played 1 year at center, has snaps at left guard. He's got experience all over the line, but he probably was up to 302 at the combine, and 6'5", 302 is super lean. And I know people are gonna be like, "Oh, Jason Kelsey," it's like, dude, those are the outliers. Those aren't the guys that you immediately go to. But Limmer's a guy that I absolutely love. What I see on film, it's just a matter of can he hold up over a 17, 18 game season.
Coming next on the Rise of Seared podcast, the best Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move to the other position on the offensive line, tackle. Not a priority, but always a need. That's coming next on Rise of Seared. We're back on the Rise of Seared podcast. Best Cardinals talk on the web. We talk about the tackles that are available. And there are some pretty good tackles. Round 1 is a good round for tackles. Unfortunately, the Cardinals kind of, they've got Jonah Williams. They've got Paris Johnson. Obviously, if they trade back and they get a tackle at 11, you find yourself in a position where, guess what? You're going to have to move him. You're going to have to move him. But there's of the tackles that we see connected with the first round. So obviously there's Joe Alt, but he's going to go to Tennessee. I think we can probably predict he's going to be in Tennessee. You've got Taliese Fuaga out of Oregon State. You've got Olufushanu, Penn State. You've got J.C. Latham, Alabama. You've got then dropping down a little bit, Tyler Guyton out of Oklahoma. We can't forget Fautanu at Washington. Are any of those guys players you could slide inside for a season?
Yeah, Fautanu, Jordan Morgan out of U of A, and Kingsley Suamataia, all three I think could be guys that you draft and play at guard for a year if you need to. They're all three guys that at 27, or if they move back to that 11, 23 that we've talked about, at 23 makes sense. I mean, like you said, 1, you can never have enough guys. 2, you play them there for a year, 2 years, let the Jonah Williams thing play itself out, kick them outside. If they're phenomenal, you leave them there and you go draft a right tackle, right? Like it gives you options. Fautanu is a bull. I mean, that guy just looks like he's going to play in the NFL for about 2 decades. Just the way, I mean, he moves different than most of these guys. He's just a different type. I mean, his jumps are absurd. I think he ends up going in the top 20. I think that's where he ends up. But if you ended up being able to get him, phenomenal. You mentioned, a guy like Taisi Fuaga, who's going to go earlier, but Fautanu is the same type of guy, right? He's the same type of physical type of mauler that looks like he's going to have, a really great career. Jordan Morgan's a really interesting one because he's going to be that guy that people watch to see what ends up happening with him from a where they play him standpoint, because you're talking about a guy that doesn't quite meet the threshold of arm length. 6'5", 311, but his arms came in sub 33 inches. His verts weren't great, but his broad was close to elite. A lot of that projects to a guard, right? Like explosive broad jump, short arms, powerful. good movement, like play could be a guard, could be a right tackle type. We'll see. He's been a left tackle only at U of A, and man, he really really played well this year and really boosted his stock to an even higher level than I think anybody down there could have expected. Suamaitai's similar. He was at Oklahoma, I believe, before, if I remember right. He is a monster, 6'5", 326. Just a different size and style of prospect. Again, really, really elite numbers. Nearly 34 and a half inch arms, massive hands, incredibly strong, and then hit the broad jump with an elite number. The thing with Suamai is that I feel like he is the perfect guy to get at 35, the ideal fit at 35, and you have a year to figure out what to do with him. You don't need him right away, but once he gets in there and it clicks that he is going to be just an absolute force to be reckoned with. Has played left tackle and right tackle. He's good at both. Had some struggles at times this year, but I think if he gets drafted to the right fit in like a place like Arizona where, like you said, there's a need, but there's not an immediate need. Like you can always upgrade, but there isn't a guy that you're just like, oh my gosh, if we start him, this is going to be a lost season. I think he's kind of the ideal guy at 35 because he gives you inside outside flexibility to see where he fits and then go from there. He's one of my favorite guys in this draft because of that flexibility and what he offers and his experience on both sides of the ball. I just think he's going to end up being a really, really fun player to watch. Amarius Mims, Tyler Guyton, those guys, they kind of profile to right or to tackles only, really. Patrick Paul the same way.
Patrick Paul's interesting because he's Josh Jones.
Right.
Because he was the guy after Josh Jones started at left tackle for 4 seasons. Patrick Paul replaced him and started 4 seasons.
Yeah. And then the guy that's really interesting to me and a guy that if he ended up there at 90 or even at 105, I might take him, and that's Blake Fisher, the Notre Dame right tackle. Everybody talks about Joe Alt. Joe Alt, I feel like he's even though, like you said, he feels like a lock at 7. I feel like he's almost underappreciated with like his size and movement skills and what he's put on tape for 3 years. But man,
he's 6'8", almost 6'9", 320.
And he moves like a power forward.
Oh my gosh.
He's just crazy. You look at Fisher, he's played 2 seasons at right tackle. He's extremely he's had an extremely good career. I think he just gets overlooked because of the fact that they have a guy that's going to go top 10 and he is extremely good in both zone and man and gap blocking. I feel like he's a guy that if he was there at 90 or 105, I feel like he'd be a really nice fit on this roster as like the next guy at right tackle.
I've heard, now this is going backwards up to but Roger Rosengarten is a guy to kind of watch in terms of surprising people how early he'll be drafted. Obviously, he out of Washington. He also had one of those monster combines at 6'5", 308, ran the 40 in 4.92 seconds and at a broad jump of 905, 30-inch vert. Where does he fit? I've even heard, I think Kuiper talked about maybe having him sneak into the first round.
Yeah, he's an interesting one. I mean, you're talking about a guy that is a very, and I don't mean this in a negative way. He's a very explosive and athletic player, but he plays like it. And what I mean by that, he's not overly physical. He's not like Fatanu is a guy that
He wants to embarrass you.
right. And Rosengarten is like a guy that is extremely athletic, can make every play, but he doesn't physically overwhelm you. And at times he seems to be able to get overwhelmed if he's not winning with his athleticism. That's my concern
Would
with
that
him.
be DJ Humphries coming out of Florida?
Yeah, and actually he profiles very similar to DJ from that standpoint. And another guy, and you mentioned, kind of that back end of the first round. Another guy was like Anton Harrison. That's another comp that I've seen come up, and he went in the back end of the first round to the Jaguars. I quite frankly have no idea how he played. I'm not going to even try to lie about it. But I'm trying to see how many games he even started. Okay, he started all 17 games. So I mean, good, at least a good rookie season, if you will. And another guy that, I'm double checking where he was drafted because I remember the name and he was in the NFL for a while. Yeah, Jamal Brown. That's another one that profiles out, a guy, and he had a really good career and then blew out his knee and then just was never the same after that. All these guys that are very tall, lean, and athletic. And like you said, that DJ Humphries, where they weren't overwhelming guys. That wasn't their game, but they win with athleticism and understanding of the game. Rosengarten's one of those guys. And, if you like him enough that you take him at 35, again, he's not going to be the physical specimen of a Kingsley Suamaitai, but he is a guy that probably is what I would call a safer pick, if he ends up being a right tackle and ends up being in the same, vein as like I said, like an Anton Harrison or something like that, where they're very good players and you need those guys. I mean, everybody wants the superstar, right? Everybody wants to have 5 all pro offensive linemen. It just
doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it just doesn't happen like that. And so, I think Rosengarten's going to be an interesting one because again, we're talking about a guy that on film hasn't been was clearly like the second or third best offensive lineman. And the vibe he gives me, and again, I don't mean to say make this sound in a negative way, but like Cole Toner, you remember Cole out of Harvard, and nice career.
Yeah, played many years. Wasn't
he just wasn't overly physical, and that's where the game overwhelmed him.
We'll have to wait and see because they had obviously they drafted John Gaines in the 4th round, but what we haven't seen so far from Monty is the 5th, 6th, 7th round offensive linemen that were a yearly occurrence for the Cardinals under Steve Keim.
And if they end up staying with 11 picks, we're going to see that because it's really hard to draft 11 times and not see day 3 offensive, defensive linemen and defensive backs.
Speedy defensive backs who can play special teams. Don't draft a quarterback. We'll talk about that on Thursday. We'll talk about quarterbacks. We're going to talk about why would we draft a quarterback. I thought Clayton Tune was a wasted pick last year. It'd be even more of a wasted pick this year. Anyway, that's good on that. We will wrap up this edition of the Rise of C-Red podcast, Best of Cardinals Talk on the web. This wraps up of our first of 4 draft preview shows for the Cardinals. We've talked receiver and we've talked offensive line. In a couple of days, we'll come back and talk about the rest of the offense, which are lower priorities for Arizona. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening as always. We'll be back again in a couple of days.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up, See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, rise up, Sea Red.